uh, without, in fact, wasting much time. Uh, we want to begin this conversation, and I think the first speaker that of this conversation is Sudhanva Deshpande, whom I would call upon to speak about. First, Sudhanva, you have been in Jana Natya Manch from 1987, much before than many people in the audience was born even, right? You have
Don't remind me how old I am.
No, I'm not. Yeah, I'm sorry. Just saying that
No,
it's
no,
been
just kidding.
so long, right? And in the sense that you are a theater artist who is very close to the streets and always challenged with the increased vulnerability uh, of the space itself, right? And how kind of art is democratized on these streets. What does a public space as a performance space, or how does it come about to be? If you could just share your thoughts about it, and then move on to the challenges of what a pandemic poses to a theater like that, where any passerby, any laborer, because I have seen you all perform in Delhi, I have been a part of that audience, and I know how it happens. Uh, how does pandemic affect you? Can we just begin with how does the space get built up? Because many of them do know about it, have read about it, do know about, of course, Sardar Hashmi, Maula Shri Hashmi, and Sudhanva Deshpande. But if you talk about it, that will be best. And I leave it to you.
Thank you very much. Very glad to be here. Good morning to everyone. I I really have to say I'm very glad to be here because just before the lockdown started, I was supposed to have come to. We had planned that
Right.
I would be in Pune. I would be at SS LA and do a 2-day kind of a
A
workshop.
3-day workshop,
3-day
yeah.
workshop. 3-day
Yeah.
workshop is what we had planned, and then the lockdown just put paid to all those plans. So even virtually, very glad to be here. Thank you very much for having me. Secondly, I want to apologize because I'm going to be doing something which I hate when other people do it, which is that I'm going to speak and co. The reason for that is simply, that we have to perform at single border today. Things have been, as you know what they have been. And this is not something that was planned when I committed to being part of today's session. But that's how movements are, that's how these things happen. And of course, there was no question of saying no to performing at single. Also because I'm part of a theater group, so everyone has to come together to perform. So therefore, my apologies, and I'm sorry that I'll be missing some of the presentations as well and the question answers. Right. As soon as the lockdown began, one of the things that struck me was the feeling of lostness that a lot of people in my immediate circle of friends were feeling. And why was that? Because these were performers. These were people who perform. Now, it didn't matter whether they were street theater performers or any other kind of performers. It didn't matter. But all performers, I think, felt a sense of suddenly being a little bit lost. And the reason was that they didn't have an audience anymore. They didn't, not just an audience, but also the fact of the act of rehearsing, the act of coming together and making work, of of struggling against material that you try and shape, and so that whole thing was suddenly boom, it was gone. This I'm talking about, let's remind ourselves, now we have all become pros at Zoom and this, that, and all the rest of it. Lots of us have Zoom accounts and etc. This I'm talking about right as soon as the lockdown began. Yeah, when a lot of people didn't even know that something like Zoom existed and so on. So that's the time I'm talking about. One of the things that happened immediately at that time is that a lot of my friends went online and started doing Facebook Live or Instagram Live sessions. And why was that? I think, some of them were exciting, some of them were okay, some of them were pretty bad, whatever it is. That I'm not one to stand in judgment of all of that. But what what I felt is that, one must have sympathy. One must have empathy for people who lose their audience. And that's something that touched me deeply. I also felt the same thing. I also felt like, oh, God, now, we can't go out and perform anymore on the streets anymore. We are street theater artists. We are, that's what I've done for the best part of my life. How do we go out and perform now? When will we go out and perform? And then, of course, in the lockdown, the great migration, the reverse migration began and all of that. Heart-rending scenes, right? It was terrible to see hundreds of thousands of workers having to go back, and so on and so forth. I'm not going into all of that, but I'm sure that you remember all of that. Now, one of the things that struck me at that time was that, it was interesting how a lot of the the online big corporate platforms saw this as an opportunity for profit making. And so the way they looked at it was to say, oh, we can garner more whatever customers, and so on and so forth. We can get more data, we can get more this, we can get people to subscribe to our services, this, that, and all the rest of it. That was there. It became immediately an opportunity for profit making. And now we know, after so many months of the pandemic, now we know that almost all over the world, in India, in the US, and in many other countries, the super rich have become even more super rich, while the vast majority of the population has seen cuts in their living standards, right? All over the world, this has happened. It's obscene. It is just obscene. It should rile us up. It should make us feel horrible at how capitalism treats human beings. And really, that's the crux of it as far as I'm concerned. Capitalism versus humanity. Now, at the same time, what also happened is, right at the beginning, within the 2 or 3 weeks of the pandemic and the lockdown, etc., what one started seeing is that a whole lot of artistic institutions, a whole lot of artist groups and so on started opening up their coffers, making access available to lots of people, right? So there were publishers who made ebooks available for free or very cheap. There were museums that opened up their, virtual sort of galleries and so on. They created special things. There were theaters that made their older performances available to people for free, all of it for free. There were film collectives that started doing online screenings for free and so on and so forth. It was really striking to me that the difference between the corporates, the capitalists, the big capitalists, and the difference on the other side with artists, was so striking. One was looking at this as an opportunity to make even greater profits than the obscenely large profits that they already make. The other had no sense of profit. They were opening up their hearts. They were opening up their art for people. Now, I want you to consider this. We all think of course, and rightly, we all think of, let's say, people in the medical profession, and so on and so forth. There's been frontline workers. They have borne the greatest sort of burden or the stress, etc., of navigating us through these times, or health workers of various kinds, mental health, physical health, etc., and so on and so forth, right? All of them, absolutely hats off to them, no question about it. But consider this. How many of us would have been able to negotiate the long lockdown, months of lockdown that we had in India, even 3, 4, 5 months of total lockdown, and then after that partial opening up, etc. But the months and months of total lockdown, how many of us would have been able to negotiate it without recourse to or without falling back upon art? It would have been impossible. If you didn't have books to read, if you didn't have online, theater and film and art to experience and so on, it would have been impossible. Think of a song like, it's become a sort of an international anthem, let's say. Think of a song like Bella Ciao, right? How many versions of Bella Ciao have we seen? all over the world, including now, my young friend Poojan Sahil has done a version for the farmers' protest, right? Ke wapas jao, wapas jao, wapas jao. Now, so many versions of Bella Ciao, and some of them are funny, some of them are, uh, whatever. Um, yeah, but some of them are so moving, right? I mean, I remember, for instance, there's one version of Bella Ciao that I've seen from Gaza in Palestine, right? This young kid and her father playing Bella Ciao um, on that instrument, right? Uh, so many versions of Bella Ciao. Incredible. In Europe, one saw people come out on their balconies and perform for the neighborhood artists, right? Musicians and so on. Now, the point I'm making is that all of this signals a fundamental difference in how artists, as opposed to corporations, look at the idea of isolation, right? So that's one point I want to make. The second point I want to make is something to do with my own field, which is street theater. Now, street theater began in India. I mean, there are different ways in which one can see it. One can say, oh, street theater has always been there in India because we've always performed in the open and so on for thousands of years, गाँव के उसमें चौपाल में नाटक होता था, etc. All of that, it's fine, fair enough. I don't have a, but street theater as we know it today is not that street theater which used to happen 1,000 years ago in villages. Street theater as we know it today is a direct result of capitalism, industrialization, urbanization, and most importantly, opposition to capitalism. It's the workers' movements, it's the farmers' movements, it's anti-capitalist movements that have nurtured or that have needed street theater to be there. Now, why is that? Because uh, street theater is an extension, in a sense, you could say. And I'm saying this with some caution because there's a way in which street theater gets seen as only sloganeering. It's a poster play and so on. So I'm not going into that direction. I don't agree with that kind of theater. Uh, I mean, sometimes you do need slogans. I'm a great one for slogans, but for the most part, I think theater needs to be theater as well. Theater needs to be artistic, theater needs to move and so on. And slogans beyond a point can't do that. Slogans can give a lot of energy, can give a lot of charge, but sometimes you need some other modes of expression than slogans. So therefore, art and performance and so on can do that. But in one sense, I'm saying that street theater is an extension of of the political slogan, of the political poster. It's an extension of wall writing. Now, these days, of course, in our corporatized cities, everyone frowns upon wall writing, and it's interesting that that companies and corporates have taken over what was actually a practice of workers' movements, which is that they would write on wall, they would paint on walls, and so on. Right? All of that has also been sort of appropriated in one sense by corporates, by elite art institutions, and so on. But fundamentally, workers' movements in urban centers in the 20th century, in the late 19th and early 20th century, needed the poster, they needed wall writing. Why? And they needed the political pamphlet that that could be distributed to workers, in their bastis or at the factory gates and so on. All of these were needed by workers. Why? Because workers' movements did not have access to the media. The media was controlled by capitalists, as it still is. In fact, more and more and more so, right? The mainstream media is totally dominated and controlled by capitalists. And so therefore, workers needed their own media. And these inexpensive forms of expressing themselves, of communicating a message, of having a dialogue became the way in which workers communicated their ideas amongst themselves. It was the poster, wall writing, and the political pamphlet. Street theater becomes an extension of all of these. Sardar called street theater the newspaper of the poor, right? And And so why is it the newspaper of the poor? Surely street theater's job is not to convey the news in that sense. And of course, today, of course, news is happening every second, right? Every second there's some breaking news happening on TV and so on. That's nonsense. But street theater doesn't aim to convey everyday news. Aaj ye hua, etc. That's not what street theater does. But what street theater does uh, um, and should do is that it has to comment on the news of the day, the things that we are living through, the times that we are living through, right? Street theater becomes a way in which we comment on that. And more than that, street theater becomes a way in which we think together of the issues of the day, the concerns that bind us all together as struggling people. In today's India, and this is my last point, in today's India, performing in the open, performing on the streets has become even more urgent than it ever was in the history of India. And why is that? That is because I believe that today the very foundations of a secular, democratic, republican nation that we have, the idea of the republic. What is the idea of the republic? The idea of the republic is, as opposed to a, let's say, a kingdom, right? Saudi Arabia is a kingdom, right? Or a theocratic state, yeah? As opposed to all of those, the idea of a republic is a simple idea that all citizens make up this republic. We, the citizens of India, give to ourselves this constitution, right? What does that mean? It means that we are all equally citizens of India, and that India, the nation, belongs equally to all of us. This fundamental idea is the one that is under siege today. This idea is being hollowed out from the inside, so that at the end of it, you may retain all the paraphernalia of a democratic society, but actually the substance of a living democracy is emptied out of it, is hollowed out of it. Why is street theater important? Or why is any kind of public art important? It is important because this is democracy in action. What street theater does is that we go out and perform, and it does not matter whether you agree with me, whether I agree with you, whether I'm able to convince you, whether you're able to convince me. That's not the point of street theater. I'm not there to convince you. I'm there to say something and for you to listen to me, and then afterwards we can have a dialogue. This idea that we can have a dialogue, that we can have it in the open on the streets, is fundamental to democracy. Democracy is not just a mela that happens once in 5 years. Democracy is something that has to happen every day, every moment, and it is something that has to be fought for. It has to be protected. It has to be contested at every place, in the public, of course, but also in the private. So democracy is not just something that is limited to town squares and so on. It also permeates our own living rooms, our kitchens, and our bedrooms. Thank you very much. I'll stop here.
No, don't stop. I have one more thing to ask from
Okay.
where you left. Yeah. You spoke about equality. What do you think will happen to the accessibility of art in post-pandemic world? And I think after this you can stop.
Well, I mean, I have two ways of looking at this, and they might seem contradictory, but actually they are not. In other words, as far as we are concerned, in street theater, we are concerned, we've done some work online and so on and so forth, but really we kept feeling, while we were doing stuff online, we kept feeling that, we are not being able to reach out to the audience that we have spent 40 odd years with. That's the urban working, the working classes, not just the factory employed workers, but the working classes as a whole, right? Formal, informal, and so on and so forth. Now, these are audiences that we cannot reach through the digital medium. And so therefore, one felt a sense of disconnect a little bit. But on the other side, let me also say that online access makes it possible for people in diverse geographies to come and sort of be part of your thing. It's now become it's not a big deal now anymore to have a, let's say, a webinar or whatever it is where there are people from 5 different countries there. It just makes it possible. Earlier one would think about, oh, ye karenge, so how do we sort of mobilize the airfares and this, that, and all the rest of it. Now the mindset has shifted. The other thing that I should just quickly say is that I've heard, meaning I've had experiences of people who, um, who who are challenged in terms of physical movement. Accessibility of venues and so on is something that now suddenly opens up because it's online, and so on. So there are, I think, different ways in which one sees this, but fundamentally, and this is also something that, immediately after this, I'm going to Singhu border. Now, there's a pandemic going on, right? And it's a comment on the government of the day, on the people who rule us today, that they have rammed through these very unconstitutional, anti-democratic laws. Unconstitutional. That in fundamentally these laws are unconstitutional. In any unbiased sort of legal sense, they would not hold scrutiny. They go against the very fundamental spirit of the letter and the spirit of the Constitution. The central government does not have locus standi to pass these laws. Now, unfortunately, the legal system being what it is today, it's quite likely that the challenge legally will be whatever. We don't know what will happen. I hope that it stands, but I'm not holding my breath on that. But the fact is that they've rammed through all of these. They've rammed through the labor codes and all of that precisely because the pandemic gave them this idea that, oh, let's do it now. Why? Because people can't protest. That people will not be able to come out and protest. It's an absolute, it's hats off. Or I don't have words actually. Hats off is nothing, But really, one is so humbled and so inspired every time that I've been to Singhu or Tikri border or Ghazipur border and so on, just to see the hundreds of thousands of people who are in the worst conditions. They've come out, and what are they doing? They're defending democracy. That's what they're doing. Over and above the issue of the laws, which is important, which is absolutely crucial to India, to what the food that we eat, etc., etc., etc. There is, at the core of it, is the issue of democracy. And they've gone out there and they've mobilized in huge numbers to defend democracy. And, that's what gives hope. And so therefore, it's really important for people like us to also do the best that we can in whatever realm we can. Not everybody can, go to Singhu or whatever it is. But, all of us can contribute in different ways. We can, through writing, through talking about it, through, doing online events, to contributing money, to helping people, design stuff, and so on and so forth. There's a whole range of things that one can contribute in. And I believe that it's really important, especially for young people, to be involved in these things because, look, this country is your country. You're going to live here for decades to come. People like us are going to go away sooner or later. This baby, you have to nurture this baby for a much longer time than I have to, right? So fight for it.